Okay, so picture this. It is 2 in the morning, April 26, 1986. In a small city in Ukraine, which back then was part of the Soviet Union, most people are asleep. The city is called Pripyat. It is a nice city, actually. Neat streets. A brand new amusement park that is supposed to open in a few days. About 52,000 people living their normal lives. And just outside the city is a nuclear power plant, a big one of the most powerful in the world. And inside that plant, on that night, a group of engineers is running a safety test, a routine safety test, the kind they had done before. Except something goes wrong. And then something goes more wrong. And then at 1:23 in the morning. That is how long the test ran before everything went wrong. The reactor power did not just increase, it increased to 10 times its maximum safe level in about 3 seconds. There was a massive steam explosion inside the reactor core, the kind of pressure that builds up instantly and has nowhere to go. It blew the roof of the reactor building clean off, 1,000-ton concrete lid, gone. And then a second explosion, and scientists still debate exactly what caused this one, which sent chunks of the reactor core flying into the surrounding area. Burning graphite, fuel rods, radioactive material, just out in the open air. The firemen who arrived first thought it was a normal fire. Nobody told them what was actually burning. Some of them picked up pieces of the reactor core with their bare hands, because nobody told them not to, because nobody told them what it was, because the people who knew what it was were already trying to figure out how to pretend it had not happened. There is a detail I want you to hold on to. The radiation levels at the site that night were so high that the dosimeters, the devices that measure radiation, maxed out immediately. They could not even read the actual level, which means the workers on site had no idea how much radiation they were absorbing. Let that sit for a second. Okay, so the reactor has exploded. Radiation is pouring into the air. The fire is burning. What does the Soviet government do? They start lying, almost immediately. The plant director, Viktor Bryukhanov, sent a report to Moscow in the early hours of the morning. The report said the reactor had been damaged. There was a small fire. The radiation levels were elevated but manageable. All of this was false. The reactor was completely destroyed. The fire was catastrophic. The radiation levels were lethal in the immediate vicinity. But here is the thing about the Soviet Union in 1986. It was not a place where you told the people in charge bad news, because bad news meant someone was to blame, and someone being to blame meant very bad things happened to that person. So Bryukhanov told them what he thought they wanted to hear, and Moscow, 1,200 kilometers away, went back to sleep. Meanwhile in Pripyat, just 3 kilometers from the exploded reactor, 50,000 people woke up that morning, made breakfast, sent their kids to school, and went to work. Nobody told them anything. The amusement park that was supposed to open in a few days? The workers showed up that morning to finish setting it up, 3 kilometers from an open nuclear reactor. So eventually, the Soviet government had to admit there was a problem. Not because they wanted to, because Swedish nuclear plant workers started setting off radiation alarms. In Sweden, 1,200 kilometers away. That is when the world found out. Because you cannot hide a radiation cloud. Now Moscow had a real problem. The reactor fire was still burning. Radioactive material was still pouring into the air, and if the fire reached the water table underneath the plant, some scientists believed it could cause a second explosion, possibly 10 times bigger than the first. So they needed people to go into the disaster zone, to fight the fire, to contain the reactor, to prevent the second explosion. These people were called liquidators. And over the next few months, between 600 Iralzalers and 800 Iralzaler people were sent into the Chernobyl exclusion zone to deal with the disaster. Some were soldiers, some were miners, some were firefighters, some were scientists. Many of them were not fully told what they were walking into. Many of them received doses of radiation far beyond what is considered safe. Many of them got sick. Many of them died. The Soviet government told them they were heroes, which they were. But heroes deserve to know the truth about the roof blows off. Not a little explosion. Not a small fire. An explosion so powerful it is visible from miles away. a fireball that shoots debris 2 kilometers into the sky, a cloud of radiation so thick that it will drift across the entire continent of Europe over the next few days. And the Soviet government's immediate response? Nothing to see here. Everything is fine. The danger they are facing, and many of them were not given that. Let me tell you about one specific group, the helicopter pilots. In the days immediately after the explosion, the main strategy for fighting the reactor fire was to drop material onto it from above. Sand, lead boron, materials that could smother the fire and reduce radiation. Sounds reasonable. Except to drop this material accurately, the pilots had to fly directly over the open reactor. The open, exploded, intensely radioactive reactor. Some pilots made over 30 flights over the reactor in a single day. The helicopter cockpits offered almost no radiation protection. One pilot, Major Anatoly Grishchenko, made over 150 flights over the reactor during the operation. He later died from radiation-induced leukemia. These men were not superheroes. They were not action movie characters. They were ordinary people. Pilots who had trained to fly helicopters and who were now being asked to do something extraordinary under extraordinary circumstances, and most of them said yes, without fully understanding the consequences, without being fully told the consequences. I want you to remember their names, not just the leaders and politicians and scientists, the pilots, the miners who dug tunnels under a burning reactor, the firefighters who showed up to a nuclear fire thinking it was a regular one, the ordinary people who walked into the most dangerous place on Earth, because someone had to. Here is something that still shocks people when they hear it. The city of Pripyat, 50,000 people, 3 kilometers from the reactor, was not evacuated immediately. They waited 36 hours. 36 hours of normal life, children playing outside, people going to work. The radiation invisible in the air around all of them. When the evacuation finally came, on the afternoon of April 27th, the residents were told to take only the essentials. They would be gone for 3 days, they were told. Just 3 days. A temporary precaution. You will be back soon. They were not going back. Nobody who left Pripyat that day ever went home again. The evacuation was done by buses, over 1,000 buses. The entire city moved out in about 3 hours. People left food on their tables, left clothes in their wardrobes, left photo albums on shelves, left toys on the floor, because they thought they were coming back in 3 days. The city of Pripyat has been empty ever since. Right now, today, as you watch this, there is a city in Ukraine with apartment buildings and a school and a hospital and a swimming pool and a cinema and an amusement park with a Ferris wheel, and nobody living in it. The Ferris wheel never opened. Not once. Chernobyl and Pripyat today are some of the strangest places on Earth. Nature has completely taken over. Trees grow through apartment floors, vines cover the school gymnasium, deer and wolves roam the streets. A fox sleeps in the kindergarten. The amusement park, the one that was supposed to open on May 1st, 1986, just 5 days after the explosion, still stands. The Ferris wheel is still there, orange and yellow, now rusted, covered in moss. It never carried a single passenger. When you look at photos of Pripyat today, there is something genuinely eerie about it. Not because it looks like a disaster zone, it doesn't really. The buildings are still standing, the streets are still there. It is eerie because it looks like a city where everyone just left. Mid-life, mid-sentence, mid-breakfast. There are still books open on desks in the school. Still gas masks on the floor of the gymnasium. They were stored there as part of Soviet civil defense preparations. Still a piano in one of the apartments. Still a wedding dress. Go back to sleep. This is the story of Chernobyl. And trust me, the cover-up is almost as wild as the explosion. Okay, before we go further, I need to explain one thing super simply. What actually is a nuclear reactor? Here is the simplest way I can put it. You know how a normal power plant works, right? You burn coal or gas, it heats water, the steam spins a turbine that makes electricity. A nuclear reactor, dumb people say, hanging in a wardrobe. A city frozen in April 1986, waiting for people who are never coming back. So, who was responsible? After the disaster, the Soviet government held a trial. 6 people were convicted, including the plant director Bryukhanov and the chief engineer. The official Soviet position was that the explosion was caused by operator error. The engineers made mistakes. The engineers were to blame. And the engineers did make mistakes. That part is true. But here is what the Soviet government did not want the world to know. The reactor design itself was flawed. The RBMK reactor, the type used at Chernobyl, had a known design flaw that made it unstable at low power levels. Exactly the conditions of that night's test. Soviet nuclear engineers knew about this flaw, but fixing it would have been expensive, and admitting it existed would have been embarrassing. So they didn't fix it, and they didn't tell the operators. The men running the test that night didn't know they were operating a reactor with a known instability at the exact power levels they were testing at. They were blamed for an accident that the system they were operating was designed to cause. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, these documents became public. The world found out. The operators had been scapegoated for a design flaw that Soviet engineers had known about for years. Some of the convicted men were eventually rehabilitated. It was too late for most of them. Let me try to give you the actual scale of what happened. The Chernobyl explosion released about 400 times more radiation than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 400 times. The radioactive cloud drifted over Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and then across much of Europe. Measurable radiation was detected in Sweden, Finland, France, the UK. An area of about 600 square kilometers around the plant, called the exclusion zone, was permanently evacuated. Over 350,000 people were relocated. The number of deaths directly caused by Chernobyl is still debated. The immediate death toll from the explosion and acute radiation sickness was 31 people. But the long-term effects, the cancers, the illnesses, the health problems in the surrounding populations, those numbers are much harder to calculate. Estimates range from a few thousand to tens of thousands of additional cancer deaths over the following decades. The economic cost of the disaster is estimated to have contributed significantly to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Think about that. One explosion, one night, one reactor, and it helped bring down an entire superpower. Here is what Chernobyl taught the world. Disasters are rarely just accidents. They are almost always the result of decisions made, or not made, long before the disaster itself. The reactor had a flaw. Someone decided not to fix it. The operators were not trained for the test. Someone decided to run it anyway. The evacuation was delayed. Someone decided to wait. The government lied. Someone decided it was better to hide the truth than face it. None of these were inevitable. Every single one was a choice. Chernobyl is remembered as a technological disaster, but it was really a human one. And that is both the most frightening thing about it and the most important. Because humans can choose differently. The firefighters who went in not knowing what they were walking into. The pilots who flew over an open reactor 30 times in a day. The miners who dug tunnels under a burning nuclear core. The scientists who risked everything to prevent the second explosion. They chose to. Chernobyl is a story about what happens when power hides the truth, and about what ordinary people do when someone finally has to face it. If you want more stories like this, real ones told simply, the way they deserve to be told, you already know what to do, is the exact same thing. Except instead of burning coal, it splits atoms, tiny, tiny atoms of a metal called uranium. And when you split them, they release an enormous amount of heat. Way more heat than any fire. That heat boils water. The steam spins the turbine. You get electricity. The tricky part is controlling it. Because if the reaction gets too powerful, too fast, it does not just burn, it explodes. And not like a normal explosion. A nuclear explosion releases radiation, invisible particles that travel through the air, through walls, through your body, and damage everything they touch at a cellular level. You cannot see radiation, you cannot smell it, you cannot taste it, but it is there, and on the night of April 26th, it was very, very there. So, back to our story. So it is the night of April 25th going into April 26th. The engineers at Chernobyl's reactor number 4 are running what should be a routine test. The idea is simple. They want to know, if the reactor suddenly loses power, Can it keep the cooling pumps running long enough to stay safe? Makes sense, right? Good thing to know. But here is where things start going sideways. First problem. The test had been planned for the day shift, but there were unexpected demands on the electricity grid that day, so it got delayed. And delayed, and eventually pushed to the night shift. The night shift engineers, who had not been trained for this specific test. Second problem. To run the test, they needed to reduce the reactor's power significantly. But when they tried to do that, the power dropped way too far, almost to zero, which is dangerous. The lead engineer on duty, a man named Leonid Toptunov, tried to stabilize it, but to get the power back up, he had to pull out almost all the control rods. Now here's the thing about control rods. They are literally what controls the reaction. Pull them out too far? The reaction can spike out of control in seconds. But the test was behind schedule. The managers were impatient. There was pressure to keep going. So they kept going. At 1:23 a.m., they initiated the test. 23 seconds later, the reactor was destroyed. 23 seconds.